In this video, I have prepared a short presentation to discuss the PIV technique and CFD simulations. I will also provide a link to this PowerPoint in the reference section at the end of the lab report form. What is PIV? Particle image velocimetry, or PIV in short, is an optical method of flow measurement used to obtain instantaneous velocity vectors of the entire flow field. The main difference between PIV and other experimental techniques such as CTA or pitot tubes is that PIV results in two or even three-dimensional vector fields. The other techniques measure the velocity at a single point and often only in one direction. So PIV will give us a lot more information about the flow. It will give us the velocity at multiple points, and it will also give us the velocity components in different directions. So how does it work? The flow is seeded by tracer particles. These tracer particles are small and their density is around the same density of the fluid. So these particles are around 10 to 15 micrometers in diameter. So they are really small and they don't affect the flow. They don't change the flow in any way. They just follow the movement of the flow. Then we have a laser that passes through some light optics and gets into a laser sheet. This laser sheet illuminates a section of the flow. Then we have a camera that captures consecutive images of the illuminated moving particles, and we will end up with images looking like this. Then we can analyze these images to get to the velocity field. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of this method? The first advantage is that it's a non-intrusive method, which means we didn't put any external object into the flow and change the physics of the flow just to measure the velocity. No, it's a non-intrusive method. And then it's a field measurement, which means we will end up with velocity vectors for every point in the flow field. It has a high accuracy and it also has a high temporal resolution. We can have consecutive images with very short time difference between them, and we will have a good idea of what is going on inside the flow. So what are the drawbacks? The tracer particles may not follow the fluid movement accurately if not chosen carefully. For example, let's say that the particles are too big. Then they will have a lot of drag and they will not follow the movement of the fluid accurately. So we should be careful when choosing the particles. They should be small and their density should be around the density of the fluid. The resulting velocity represents the average over the entire interrogation window. We will talk about interrogation window in the next slides. And then powerful lasers and high resolution cameras may be safety and cost prohibitive. How do we process the PIV images to obtain velocity? To answer that, let's first take a look at the definition of cross-correlation. Cross-correlation is a measure of similarity of two series as a function of the displacement of one relative to the other. Here we have the cross-correlation of f and g as a function of tau. So basically we slide g with an amount of tau and then calculate the integral. We can see that this function has a maximum at a value of tau where f and g are the most correlated. Because when they are correlated, their values add up in the integral. But when they are not correlated, their values in general doesn't add up. They cancel each other out. For example, large values of f gets multiplied by small values of g and produce small values. And then the integral will not be maximized. I can explain this better with a video. So in this video, don't pay attention to the image in the middle. Pay attention to the values of f and g and their cross correlation. So when the f and g are are related, then their cross correlation is at maximum, and their cross correlation is at minimum when they are not correlated. So this is because when peaks or positive areas are aligned, they make a large contribution to the integral. Similarly, when negative areas of the signals align, they also make a positive contribution to the integral, because the product of two negative numbers is also positive. But if the two signals are not correlated, then in general they cancel each other out because their maxima does not happen in sync with each other. So in two dimensions, let's pause the video. In two dimensions, like the PIV images that we have, remember we have consecutive PIV images that are two-dimensional. We have X and we have Y, and we have the intensity of the signal as a function of this X and Y. So let's say that frame 1 is F and frame 2 is G. Then we have a two-dimensional cross correlation, which is a function of M and N. M and N are the amount of displacement in G relative to F. Then the result would be a two-dimensional map in M and N, like the one you see here. At a specific value of M and N, we will get a peak in the cross correlation. So we have a mathematical tool. To find the amount of the slide that we need for image G to match image F. So with that mathematical tool, let's explain the PIV algorithm. The idea is simple. We divide image 1 into small regions called interrogation windows. Then we search image 2 for this interrogation window for a match. So image 2 is also divided to equal or slightly larger regions called search area. For each interrogation window, we search the corresponding search area on image 2 for a match. How do we search? We search with cross correlation. The cross correlation function between each interrogation window and search area is found. The location of the maximum cross correlation peak shows the amount of displacement for each interrogation window to match the search area on image 2. So then the velocity is found as the displacement over the time difference between image 1 and image 2. Let's also talk about CFD simulations. Computational fluid dynamics, or CFD, is a branch of fluid mechanics that uses numerical analysis to simulate and solve equations that involve fluid flows. In fluid dynamics, we have the governing equations and we could solve them to get all the answers that we need. But the equations are so complex that they cannot be analytically solved, at least not yet. If one of you was the one to first solve them, then your name will enter the history books. But until then, we have to numerically solve them under the specific circumstances of the application at hand, which are called boundary and initial conditions. Here I don't want to get into details of CFD simulations, mainly because this is the subject of a full graduate level course, but I'm gonna try to explain the basic concepts. So first, we discretize the flow field into small regions called mesh or cells. Have in mind that time also needs to be discretized into small time steps. Now, the mesh doesn't have to be uniform. In fact, it's better if we have smaller mesh in regions in which we have large gradients, like near the walls of a solid object, like these regions, and have larger mesh in regions where we don't have large gradients, so that we can save some computational cost, like the regions away from the airfoil. Then we have to have also a discretization scheme. This can be finite difference, finite volume, or boundary element. In finite difference, the differential equations are solved using finite difference approximations. In finite volume, the conservation laws like conservation of mass or conservation of energy are applied to small volumes of the fluid. So here the formulation would be slightly different from the finite difference methods. In the boundary element method, we try to link the internal properties of the flow to their values at the boundaries. This way, uh, we can solve for less cells and save computational cost. For example, this method is useful for modeling water waves in large bodies of water like lakes or oceans. Then we have to set the boundary conditions. And at each boundary, we need to set these conditions. For example, at the boundary near the solid, we have the no slip condition, which means u and v velocity are zero at the boundary. Or at the inlet, we may have the inlet velocity, for example, 1 meter per second in the x direction. Or at the outlet, we may have the pressure. That's another boundary condition. So basically, at each boundary, we need to specify the boundary conditions, and also we have to set the initial conditions for all of the flow field at the time 0. Then we need to have also a turbulence model. So when we want to solve the simultaneous Navier-Stokes equations for a turbulent flow, we have a lot of rapid fluctuations in our flow properties. If we were to solve for all these irregular random fluctuations at all length scales, we would end up with huge amounts of computations that are practically impossible to do. So we don't solve Navier-Stokes for all these fluctuations. We'll solve the equation for the mean velocity values at each time window, and then try to mimic the turbulence effect through the so-called turbulence models. Most of the turbulence models are empirical equations derived from some experimental observation with specific assumptions. For example, I mentioned here the most used ones: RANS, K epsilon, LES, DNS, and MFD. Very briefly, we have the RANS or URANS, which is the unsteady case of RANS. RANS stands for Reynolds Averaged Navier-Stokes, which, as I said, averages out the fluctuations at small time steps. Then we have K epsilon or K omega methods, which try to find the Reynolds stresses using two intermediate variables, K and epsilon, derived from empirical relations. Then we have the large eddy simulation, which filters out the small eddies and solves only for the larger ones, which contain most of the fluid energy. Then direct numerical simulations that try to directly solve the instantaneous Navier-Stokes equations without any turbulence model. This is highly accurate, but very computationally expensive. We also have MFD, which stands for Molecular Fluid Dynamics. These models the intermolecular forces between fluid molecules and solves the fluid motion on a molecular level. Just imagine how many molecules are in a tank of water. The amount of computational power needed is just crazy. Yeah, in general, as we want to be more accurate, we have to pay the price, which in the case of CFD simulations is computation time. So that's all for this video. See you in the next one.